On today's Live Open Daily, Meta was right to not put eye tracking in the Quest 3, but if you care about that, don't worry, there's a third-party solution on the way. I'm your host, Live Open Mike, and we've gone through a couple of cycles of this with Quest 3. First, when PlayStation VR 2 was announced to have eye tracking, and we started seeing all these amazing demos of stuff like changing your weapon with eye tracking in Firewall Ultra, and the prospects of dynamic foveated rendering for the performance boost. We saw it again when Apple at WWDC announced the Apple Vision Pro, and everyone saw that wonderful looking, really well marketed demo from Apple, showing all the eye track navigation and how easy it was to do everything with the eye tracking and the pinch gesturing, as opposed to using controllers as a makeshift mouse. And now we've seen it again because now we have this third-party solution that Upload VR did a really excellent write-up on. We'll get to that a little bit later in the podcast. And everyone's saying, well, you know what? Meta made a mistake not putting eye tracking in the Quest 3. It should have been easy, yada, 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 yada. I made a video on my YouTube channel over a year ago, May of 2023, before Quest 3 even came out, explaining why Quest 3 did not have eye tracking and why it made sense. But people still push back on it, especially after PSVR 2 came out and we started seeing some of the results of what that looked like. We're now 16 months after PlayStation VR 2 launch. We've now seen the Apple Vision Pro hit the market and everyone just talking nonstop about how amazing eye tracking is, so on and so forth. And the prevailing narrative has become that the Quest 3 not having eye tracking is some massive L for Meta. Personally, I don't think so, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. First, Andrew Bosworth addressed part of this on the recent Instagram Ask Me Anything. We covered that whole thing last week, but I'm going to replay what he said here because it kind of illustrates some of my point for me.
I think we're headed that direction as a platform, as an industry. Right now there's a lot of trade-offs that come with eye tracking in terms of cost, in terms of compute, in terms of architecture, and we're working on systems and methods for making it cheaper and making it fit into more architectures and accommodating it more and making it more accurate. One thing that's interesting with eye tracking is it's not mixed reality is a part of the platform. If you don't have it, there's a bunch of functionality that's not available to you, and there's no way to simulate it because it's like your interface with the physical world around you. Whereas with eye tracking, there are usually workarounds that do work, and so you can simulate it in social situations. You can use a different input methodology, and so we believe in it. We're working on it. We're advancing it, but it's also it is a feature that we don't want to bring to the platform until we think it's ready for everybody and worth the cost architecturally, financially, and thermally.
He said a lot of things there, but one of the important things to remember right away is that Meta Quest 3 wasn't developed in the span of a couple of months. This is something that they were doing R&D on for several years, and when they were looking at what they were going to compromise on, what their priorities were, always got the impression that Meta prioritized the lenses and the clarity, which is why we got pancake lenses, but to scale it down to a more affordable package than what we got with the $1,500 Quest Pro. A lot of people forget because it's $1,000 now, the Quest Pro was originally $1,500. A lot of that reason was the additional eye and face tracking and the pancake lenses, which at the time were a little bit more expensive. But Meta and all of these companies, Sony went through this, I'm sure Apple went through this, HTC went through this with their Vive Pro Eye. The research and development of these headsets is not something that happens quickly, and when you look at something like the Quest Pro, a lot of people praise the open design of that, and you don't feel like you don't have all the light blockers and everything around you. Those are optional. I think some of that was for heat dissipation because you had the facial interface and that's fastened to your actual forehead all around here. All the heat coming out of the headset, yes, it has vents around the top of it, but that heat has to escape somewhere. Sometimes that's going to escape directly into your face. We look at the cameras for eye and face tracking on top of something like mixed reality. That's a lot more thermal output that's being put out by that headset, and most likely they made the choice of, okay, we can either do eye tracking and face tracking, or we could do full color mixed reality and make that the best it can be, include the depth sensor that was ripped out of Quest Pro, and I think they went in what I believe is the proper direction. Why? Well, let's look at some headsets that have had eye tracking in the last 2 years or so. The Vive Pro Eye generally gets a pass because it's pretty much a PCVR only headset, and frankly HTC and Meta are kind of playing in different sandboxes, but the Vive Pro Eye is also a very expensive headset. And if Meta had included eye tracking on top of everything else for the Quest 3, probably would have raised that price, which was right now double the price of a Quest 2. Probably would have pushed it to around, I'm going to say $700 to $800, which would have been well out of the price range of a lot of people, especially those who may have bought their Quest 2 for $300, like the majority of people did during the pandemic. To now release a headset that is over double that price just for the sake of eye tracking doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Then you look at the spectacular failure of the Quest Pro, which is a failure of software more than hardware, but it illustrates the point that I'm going to get to with PlayStation VR 2 in just a second. Quest Pro failed not because it was too expensive or because it wasn't ready for market, it didn't have the software support to justify that price and that level of investment. The pancake lenses of the Quest 3 are something that every single user immediately benefits from, with the edge-to-edge clarity, the improved visuals, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, if you take eye tracking into account, especially on a platform like PlayStation VR 2, which doesn't have social apps, there are over 200 games available for PlayStation VR 2 right now, and less than half of those are actually using dynamic foveated rendering or using eye tracking in any meaningful way, whether you're looking like menu navigation, dynamic foveated rendering, aim assist, anything like that. A lot of these games, especially since they're coming from Quest ports, are just being ported to PSVR 2 with some upscaling to the visuals, but not implementing that piece. So just thinking about the cost-benefit analysis and your return on investment for your different features, they're benefiting more from the pancake lenses than if they use, say, Fresnel lenses and they put eye tracking in there, because then they'd be in pretty much the same boat that PlayStation VR 2 is in, where every game that did not release with eye track foveated rendering, reviewers and gamers were complaining about the visuals being blurry, and there's countless examples of that on PlayStation VR 2. The original reviews for No Man's Sky before they put DFR in, everyone complained that the visuals were on par with, if not worse than the PlayStation VR 1 visuals. Switchback, Hellsweeper, I could go on and on and on, but it wasn't a feature that was heavily adopted by the entirety of that market for one reason or another. And again, compare that with the pancake lenses, where every single person who put on the Quest 3 immediately saw the edge-to-edge clarity and the sharpness of that. Those are the trade-offs that you're making. VR is a game of compromises, and Meta kind of made the choice of, okay, we can either go this way or go this way. Then it's just a matter of timing, and I think this is something that Sony may live to regret when they look back on the PlayStation VR 2 in like a year or two from now. To properly use eye track dynamic foveated rendering, we talked about this on the Hellsweeper episode, if you're in Unity, you need to use something called the Universal Render Pipeline, because the standard render pipeline, which is the pipeline that almost every developer has been on for the last several years now, did not support dynamic foveated rendering. So almost every developer who wanted to use that feature that was using Unity, I'll get to Unreal in a second, but if you're in Unity, you had to switch your game from one render pipeline to the other, which necessitated basically breaking your game and rebuilding it all over again. Again, Mixed Realms, the developers of Hellsweeper, documented this in great detail. I'll link to that podcast episode in the show notes. That's a whole other round of quality assurance checking, going through every single square inch of the game and making sure you didn't break something before you bring it out to the masses. It's a process that took Mixed Realms and Hello Games, the makers of No Man's Sky, literal months to do. The jury's still out on whether that moved the needle for games like Switchback VR, like Hellsweeper, like Bulletstorm, whether or not that renewed interest in their game and people came back to it after they upgraded the visuals. If you're on Unreal Engine 4, which again is what a lot of developers were using for the last several years, because Unreal Engine 5 was not a thing until about a year and a half ago, something like that. Unreal 4 did not support dynamic foveated rendering as well. So again, if you want to move to Unreal 5, that is a process, and Xreal Games, the makers of Zero Caliber 2, have documented this. That is a process that is going to take months, if not upwards of a year to do. So if you're going to stall your game for months or upwards of a year, probably not for a small studio, which most VR studios are. That's going to bankrupt them. So think about the timing. Quest 3 came out 8 months after PlayStation VR 2 came out, and in the 8 months between those two headsets, we saw nothing but complaints about the games that didn't have DFR on PlayStation VR 2, and again, the visuals were blurry, yada yada yada, go on and on and on. There's so many different examples of that, and we've seen that continue in the last 8 months since Quest 3 came out. So now we're at a point where 16 months after PlayStation VR 2 hit the market, less than half of that library has dynamic foveated rendering. So if you're looking at a feature that less than half the games that your platform are going to use, well, maybe it was a smart call. Then the argument can be made that, oh, well, Quest has a much bigger platform for like social VR. There's VR chat, there's Rec Room, there's Meta Horizons. It makes more sense to put eye tracking on that model. Okay. How'd that work out for those other headsets? Were people gobbling up the Vive Pro Eye and to the tunes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of sales because they can move their eyes to VR chat? Or what about the Quest Pro? Because I'm pretty sure it sold roughly 50,000 units. Didn't really move the needle. Then you look at the PlayStation VR 2 sales and the reports that Sony is not happy with the sales of the PlayStation VR 2. And now there's all this doom and gloom around that headset, and Sony's scaling down production. They've only got 2 first-party titles in development. My larger point is that, by and large, eye tracking has really kind of failed to move the needle. And then that brings us to Vision Pro. Now, Vision Pro is playing in a different sandbox than Meta. That's a $500 headset versus a $3,500 headset, 7 times the cost. But even with the eye tracking integrated into that headset, we're already seeing reports that Apple has already just scrapped or at least put on the shelf their next iteration of the high-end version of that headset, and they're trying to get down to something that's more cost affordable, presumably because people didn't gobble up the AVPs in droves like they thought they would. Yeah, like early tech adopters and content creators were going to grab it first, but your general consumer, that really didn't move them. And if your whole presentation was based around eye track navigation and a hand pitch gesture and being able to watch movies in your headset, but basically the eye tracking was the star of that show, it was featured more than any other feature on that headset, including the really weird looking eyesight thing. And while there was a ton of hype and a ton of people lining up for demos, how many people actually bought it? My point is that eye tracking by and large doesn't really move the needle like people think it is. It's an amazing feature. I agree it should be on every future Quest headset, but is it moving the needle and selling headsets now? Not really. It's every developer out there making VR games falling over themselves to upgrade their games to Unreal 5 or the URP for Unity just so they can include eye track dynamic foveated rendering in all of their games? No. By the way, I also have not mentioned the Pimax Crystal, which also launched with eye tracking. And how did the public respond to that? How's Pimax responding to that? Well, Pimax is about to put out another headset that is just purely for gaming with no eye tracking involved because that module is more expensive and they need to get the cost down to make it more affordable for more people to be able to buy it. The reality is that that tech, while very nice to show off and looks great and is easy to use, is a very expensive feature that doesn't really have widespread adoption yet. As much as tech heads and other VR enthusiasts, especially people who are like PC VR diehards or like social VR diehards, will try to convince you otherwise, your general consumer really doesn't care all that much about it, at least beyond doing like a demo at Apple Store and then realizing, you know what, that's really cool, but it's not worth that amount of money. So I was reading about this new third-party tracker from a company called Enzi for Quest 2 and Quest 3. They were supposed to be at AWE, that's the Augmented World Expo for those who don't know. Last week, they actually had the booth there, but they were not doing live demos. The article reads, existing headsets with eye tracking like Apple Vision Pro and PlayStation VR 2 use infrared cameras combined with infrared LED illuminators that help them see your eyes. The actual tracking is done using computer vision algorithms that analyze each frame and output the size and position of your pupil. Enzi's approach is very different. It also has infrared illuminators, but instead of cameras, it uses an array of 6 simple and inexpensive photosensors that measure the intensity of the reflection of this infrared light off your eye. Each part of your eye reflects infrared light with a slightly different intensity, and Enzi's neural network uses the intensities reported by the photosensors to determine the exact position of your pupil. Enzi claims this approach uses 5 times less battery than camera-based eye tracking, can easily run at 1000 Hz, and has less than a single millisecond of latency. In comparison, camera-based eye tracking typically runs at 120 Hz and has 10 milliseconds of processing time. This high refresh rate and low latency means the foveal region and foveated rendering can be smaller, and thus applications can run at higher foveal resolution, achieve better performance, or a balance of the two. However, Enzi's approach is slightly less accurate than camera-based eye tracking. Enzi claims an accuracy of around 2 degrees compared to less than 1 degree for camera-based eye tracking. This means it wouldn't support gaze-based user interfaces with very small elements such as some apps and menus in Vision OS, aka the Apple Vision Pro. It also doesn't support reporting the dilation of the pupil, but this is rarely used for applications anyway. The $160 price of the Lumia add-on for Quest headsets is being set to make a healthy profit that covers Enzi's research and development costs, but the startup claims the photosensors and emitters themselves cost less than $10. The add-on connects to your Quest via USB-C and the headphone jack and features USB-C pass-through so you can continue to charge the headset and use audio devices while using it. The next part here is very important. To be clear though, this won't magically turn your Quest 3 into a Quest Pro 2. Applications won't use eye tracking unless they specifically integrate Enzi's SDK, and so this will mainly be used for PC VR, where the open nature of the PC platform makes it easier to integrate accessories like this via OpenXR. This photo sensor approach to eye tracking could make the feature standard in all headsets in future, even the lowest cost headsets. Assuming it works well, I would imagine seeing it in Meta Quest 4, and it might even be how eye tracking one day arrives in AR glasses. The Enzi Lumia add-on for Quest doesn't have a specific release timeline, but you can place a $1 refundable deposit to get it for a discounted price of $100 when or if it does ship. A couple of things to take away from that. Number one, this doesn't seem to have any kind of implication for standalone apps. This article is from David Haney of Upload. He does a lot of good content and he's very, very knowledgeable about this, so I kind of trust his judgment here. And he basically says that it's only going to be used for PC VR. According to the last Steam hardware survey, there's roughly 1 million users, a little bit less than half a million, it's like 900,000 something, of people who are on Steam VR are using a Quest headset, either a Quest 2, a Quest Pro, or a Quest 3. Not all of those people are going to be using it for VR chat. That's just real, just breaking up the numbers. So if you're looking at the number of users for VR chat who don't already have something that has eye tracking or extra trackers, you're basically cutting down the number of people in your audience who are going to be able to use this. Because this is not going to work for standalone apps for a multitude of reasons, that inherently limits the usefulness of this because, like the article states, you will not be able to use this because of the style of the eye tracking for menu navigation and all the things you get with Apple Vision Pro. This seems to be almost exclusively an add-on for people who use social VR on their Quest headset in PC VR and want to have additional tracking. Just those three qualifiers right there inherently limits the number of people who are going to want to buy this. And just thinking about this tech, every other headset that is currently using eye tracking, the Vive Pro Eye, the Pimax Crystal, the PlayStation VR 2, the Quest Pro, I'm sure I'm forgetting some in there, all use camera-based tracking. If you don't think 4 major tech companies, that's Pimax, Sony, Meta, and HTC, did not take a look at this specific style of eye tracking, this type of technology, and deem it, you know what, this probably isn't good enough for the purposes that we need, you're playing yourself. I'm very skeptical of this, specifically because this is a third-party developer bringing this to market, as opposed to one of the major companies who will spend millions upon millions of dollars on research and development for their headsets for things like eye tracking. And if all 4 of those companies have decided to go with camera-based tracking, I think there's a specific reason for that. And like all new tech, I'm a little bit skeptical because, frankly, we don't know what we don't know. I say this every single time a new piece of tech comes out, especially in the VR space, which is still in its nascent stages. There's always compromises, there are always trade-offs whenever we deal with something like this. Perhaps this thing runs insanely hot once you're inside the headset with the facial interface. Using full settings, so your brightness turned all the way up, 120Hz refresh rate, you're barely getting 2 hours out of that headset. Any additional battery drain, no matter how small, is going to reduce your experience time quite a bit, unless you're someone who already bought the strap. I would imagine that anyone who buys an eye tracking add-on probably already has a battery solution for this, but it is something to think about, that increased battery drain. And then there's also the pass-through charging. I went through this when I was researching for another video. The Quest 3 has an 18-watt charger, and ideally, to be able to keep your Quest 3 charged, you need to have a battery, a high-capacity battery or a plug that's going to give you at least 18 watts of energy pretty consistently to keep the headset charged. Most other pass-through solutions, if you look at like Bluetooth headphone pass-through solutions and things like that, where they have a port on the outside edge of that so you can plug a USB port into that, a lot of those aren't doing pass-through with 18 watts. Matter of fact, I don't know if a single Bluetooth pass-through that actually does that. So is this piece of tech accounting for that? Or are we going to have like a really quick battery drain on the Quest 3 because the pass-through is not giving enough energy to keep the headset charged? That's something that a lot of these third-party battery manufacturers have had to deal with. Bobo just released a whole new strap a few months ago with an increased battery charge because most of the ones that were hitting the market, including some of the ones I reviewed, weren't good enough to keep the headset charged for longer than like an extra hour or something like that. There just wasn't enough energy to account for Quest 3's increased battery drain over Quest 2. So when this says it's going to pass through charge to that immediately makes me skeptical, just because of my experience, that's not been something that's been easily solved. And then this is just a personal thing. They were supposed to do demos at AWE. They had the booth there and they were just talking about the tech, but they didn't actually have a hands-on model ready to go. That immediately makes me a little bit skeptical because you don't get this article out there, you're not putting out press releases unless, frankly, you're trying to fundraise. And the last thing is dynamic foveated rendering on PC VR. Yes, dynamic foveated rendering does exist on some level using the OpenXR platform, but straight from the mouth of developers, the performance gains are minimal compared to if you actually build it into the app itself. This is going to still need a fair amount of app support, like any dynamic foveated rendering, to be able to get the performance gains that people are talking about. There's different levels to this, and I don't think enough people know that. If you're just using the system-wide OpenXR version for PC VR, you're getting maybe 10, at most 15%, but you're trading that off for thermals, for increased battery drain and battery draw, and frankly at 10%, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of that overhead. And frankly, at a 10% boost to performance, you're probably not going to see a lot of that overhead in the headset itself if your headset was already performing at an optimal level. By bringing it all back to the original premise of the podcast, which is the Quest 3, if the Quest 3 was being developed a couple of years ago, knowing that most games and most developers were still using either the standard render pipeline for Unity or Unreal 4 for Unreal Engine, and they were going to have to convert all their games over, that was going to be a months to years process for that to happen. At the time Quest 3 started development, and at the time a lot of these games started development, the URP for Unity and Unreal 5 was not really ready to go for people to convert to fully because there was still bug testing to do. It just becomes a matter of timing, a matter of price, a matter of adoption, and a matter of the additional costs in terms of like thermal compute and overhead on the headset. It makes sense that Quest 3 doesn't have eye tracking. I will die on this hill. This is take the eye standby. I think it should be in every Quest headset moving forward, but it didn't make sense for the Quest 3. That's a wrap for this episode. Feel free to tell me I'm crazy. Wouldn't be the first time. You can get the Live Open Daily and my other podcast, the XR Remix Podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeart, and YouTube. Also check me out on the Twitch. I stream VR there a couple of days a week. I'm at Live Open Mic. Thanks, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.